Hello, everyone. So this week, the Vavris chapter told us about how people of color have been criminalized in the past, from slaves being literally and legally placed in the category of criminal, to how black plantation workers were hired in a system that left them indebted to the plantation owners with no way to pay them back, to the fabricated profiles of black people being aggressive towards white women, and then a people who seemingly turned against a society that cared for them and then committing crimes towards whites for no reason, which we know that didn't happen. That's not true. Vavris outlined staggering statistics about the reality of racial profiling and the incentives that followed the result of that profiling by law enforcement, incarceration rates among blacks compared to whites, and the extreme punitive measures against young people in the juvenile system, which the school to prison pipeline shows us is primarily and predominantly black, and that's backed up in the statistics provided that black youth account for, 45% of arrests. Finally, Vavris shared 15 recommendations stemming from a few different ideologies to attempt to quell this mass incarceration of black youth and offer restorative justice without punishment. In Brian's article, a few key points are made and backed up, including the current demographic of teachers being predominantly white women, the current demographic of pre-service teachers being white women, and the pipeline into teacher pre-service programs they're also predominantly white women. This can have a huge influence on the treatment of students of color, and Brian specifically looks at the perception and treatment of black boys in the classroom. Brian points out that the perception of students of color by teachers is almost always one of deficit, both academically and behaviorally. In addition to that deficit perspective, black students are rarely encouraged, let alone celebrated, simply for their blackness. This perspective is not just in the classroom, but another thing that's mirrored in society and can be passed from one person to the next, following Harrow's cycle of socialization. Beyond that perception, black boys are penalized for minor infractions at a much higher rate than their white peers, which those white peers see and then develop their own deficit perception of those black boys. In addition, the black boys see that they are not worth, the gentle reminding that their peers get, and start to learn that the school and the classroom is not a safe place for them. And we as educators know all children need to feel safe in order to learn. And Brian puts out the call that not only do we need to have more representation in teachers and pre-service programs, but we also need to train teachers and pre-service teachers to acknowledge, value, and embrace cultural ways of knowing and being of children of color, and provide them opportunities to examine themselves and their teaching and disciplinary practices. And both of those are quotes from Brian's article. Especially to break the cycle of how they've observed their own teachers interact with and discipline black boys. Finally, Brian describes how all of this contributes to the school to prison pipeline at the different levels of schooling, and gives his recommendations for change in teacher education programs to start to undo all of these negative cycles, including utilizing culturally relevant pedagogy that allows white teachers to explore their own racial identities, teaching specifically about the education and treatment of black males, and bringing and keeping pre-service teachers of color. Finally, I'll intertwine some of the summaries of the videos with my personal reactions and in the analysis section, and I am transitioning to my personal reaction. My strongest personal reactions were in response to each of the videos. It's really shocking to hear people actively serving in our police force say that they would stop a group of black people, boys, for being in a white neighborhood because they don't belong there, whether they were on duty or not. That statement just immediately brought me back to Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others who are in a place that someone else arbitrarily decided that they did not belong. The video, Gone Too Far, Kids in Handcuffs, hit hard as well, because that could have been one of my students. In both of my previous teaching positions, I had students just like Kyle Thompson, students who had personalities that were loved by the staff, that worked hard in what they were interested in, and made some mistakes along the way. What differs, however, in both Kyle's experience and my own, is how those mistakes are and were dealt with. For many white students, any mistake, even large infractions, are met with discussions with teachers and administrators, calls home, and a return to the classroom with the equivalent of a clean slate. Kyle, as a black boy, had the story changed on him, with the teacher playing and laughing one minute, then walking out the door without a word to the next. So one was not even given the chance to talk about what happened and learn why the list he made was a mistake. Two was handed a punishment by the police in handcuffs before even being addressed by the teacher or the school. It wasn't even discussed in the school where it happened, where learning is supposed to happen. I've seen similar situations with my students, and I've advocated for my students of color, my students from low socioeconomic classes, and my students who come to their first day of a new school year already labeled a troublemaker and not worth the time by other teachers to receive just treatment. Meanwhile, many white students get to come back and learn as if nothing happened in the eyes of the teachers, which students see. Students of color, students from lower socioeconomic class, and students from families with troubled pasts see their peers commit the same, if not worse, infractions in school and get nothing more than a few minutes outside the classroom, while they themselves might receive lengthy suspensions and all eyes on them when they come back into the room, days later usually. And they internalize that feeling of mattering less and of not deserving the respect of a discussion on why a certain action or conversation is appropriate or not, and not being worthy of learning both the academic lessons and the life lessons that happen in the classroom. At this point, I'm going to transition to my analysis and evaluation section. If a police person is saying they would stop a group of black boys in a white neighborhood and interrogate them as to what they were doing there because they do not belong, which we heard directly from an officer in the New York Times video, A Conversation with Police on Race, what is going to stop a classroom teacher from assuming a black child is doing something they shouldn't be and doling out what they view as an appropriate punishment, especially at a time where the teacher has not had a break or is feeling burnt out maybe at the end of the day, much like what was touched upon in the New York Times video, Snacks and Punishment. It may seem trivial, but teaching days are long days, and the time of an infraction could be the difference between a discussion and handcuffs. Racial profiling is rampant in the United States, and this is a quote from Vavris. Most common is the practice that targets predominantly African American or Hispanic minorities, generally but not exclusively, in stops and searches by local and state police. When in reality, neither party, the police officer, the teacher, or whatever party we're talking about, is acting on anything other than prejudice and stereotype, such as the stereotype of black girls being rowdy and unruly, causing them to, and this is a quote from Love, be suspended at a rate of 6 times higher than that of their white female peers. Further, when that teacher decides a student of color is where they should not be in a zero-tolerance school, that child does not get the respect of a discussion with a teacher about the situation, and punishment does not happen in the classroom where the situation occurred, where the learning is supposed to occur, and instead lands them squarely in the school-to-prison pipeline, with the other 1,000 children locked up each year for minor offenses such as truancy, like what was presented in the beginning of the Frontline Prison State School-to-Prison Pipeline video. In addition to acting on stereotypes, white teachers and police officers and whoever we're talking about in this situation continue to perpetuate these stereotypes. Nathaniel Bryan says, white teachers influence white children's perception of black boys as they disproportionately target and discipline black males for minor and subjective school and disciplinary infractions, all of which ensures that these prejudices, these microaggressions, and acts of racism persist through another generation. The need for non-punitive restorative justice alternatives, as outlined by Vavris, is at an all-time high, especially for students of color. By statistics alone, black bodies are incarcerated at a rate 5 times higher than whites. In the country with the highest percentage of its population imprisoned, and a child or teen with an incarcerated parent is much more likely to exhibit behaviors that would cause them to be in trouble in the classroom, such as trouble with collaboration, managing conflict, and controlling their emotions, which will put them directly into the school-to-prison pipeline. There's no break to the cycle and the continued racial discrimination in the classroom without non-punitive restorative justice that must also, as outlined by Bettina Love, be mirrored in society. And this is a quote from Love. We need pedagogies that support social movement, as educational justice cannot and will not happen in a vacuum or with pedagogies that undergird the educational survival complex.